looking back after the break. I travel to Columbus, Ohio each year to the ISSA Cybersecurity event. This conference is a great value, sort of a boutique security event. It's small, but loaded with powerful content. David Kennedy, who you saw in the Katie Kirk interview, is a regular speaker there. I go to learn, of course, but I also go to scout for interesting speakers who I might be able to lure to our event in West Virginia. Next, we'll hear from Ernie Hayden, a Securicom executive consultant whose message and character resonated with me when I saw him speak at the ISSA event earlier this year. The title of his talk turned my head around. It suggested that we should all make the presumption that we are already breached. Ernie has an impressive bio, and his work includes extensive experience in the power utility industry, critical infrastructure protection, information security domain, industrial controls, security, cybercrime, and cyber warfare areas. Ernie has a rich out-of-work life that includes, among other things, his artistic inclination toward dramatic landscape photography. He travels extensively for his work, and he shared many stories with us over dinner last night. I think the rest of what you need to know about Ernie today will shine through in his presentation. Please join me in welcoming Ernie Hayden to West Virginia for the first time.
Well, thanks, Jim. I'm honored to be here, and it was a pleasure to have met Jim and his delightful wife, Freda, up in Columbus several months ago. So when Jim approached me and asked me to come talk to you about this talk, I was pleased, honored, and I thank you very much. And I'm afraid I don't know much about West Virginia. I'm probably like most Americans that do have an exposure to West Virginia, and it's when you go from Pennsylvania to Ohio and you drive through the Panhandle, and that's it, right? Except for you know, either basketball or football, right? Because West Virginia has usually made it to the final, at least the Sweet 16 several years in a row, I'm quite sure. Before I start this talk, I also want to tell you a few things that resonated with me and are relative to the talk from earlier. For example, the comment from the lady from Katie Couric was talking to, saying, well, I'm unhackable. There is not a single person in this room, myself included, who's not unhackable. I guarantee you. Guarantee you. We're going to talk about that. Another thing that surfaced was people are still our weakest link. When I've done a CISO job 4 times, and I remember my very first interview as a CISO, and someone asked me, says, what do you think is the most important role of a CISO? And I said, the first line of defense for cybersecurity and physical security is the individual employee. And I still firmly believe that. Because as a CISO, you can't do it. It's impossible. You need everybody's help. So everybody in this room is an important player for Jim to protect the state of West Virginia. So that's just one other thing to think about. And then the final comment that kind of hit me as I was listening, I think it was under Kelvin's discussion, is that there's really 2 types of people. It says those who know they've been hacked and those who don't know they've been hacked. Okay? But they've both been hacked. Okay, so even if you don't think you've been hacked today, then you are not using any technology at all. And if you are, fantastic. But I don't know many people that are doing that right now. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to try and make this a very interesting talk for you. And it's an area that I have had very, very strong belief in and opinions about for several years, and even though I'm declaring this a new paradigm, I think the first time I've actually spoke and wrote about this was about 3 or 4 years ago, and the first time I was introduced to this concept was by a friend of mine who's the CISO for the University of Washington in Seattle. He taught me about this concept in 2002. Okay, so we just have to, I guess we're not doing a very good PR campaign. We have to keep on shoving out to the audiences. So what I'm going to do is talk about the old paradigm, which we'll talk about in a moment, the new one, and then what do we do, and then I'm more than happy to either do discussion and Q&A here, or of course I'll be here all day, so if you want to try and connect afterwards. How many of you have CISSP? Okay, it's a certification as a cybersecurity. Okay, I see one back there. Okay. Other security certifications, Security Plus. Okay. Got it. All right, well, when you start doing security training, the first thing they talk about is layered defense. And they talk about firewalls, and they talk about the castle kind of a concept where you have these giant walls, and you're protecting everything on the inside. So just as some examples, here's a castle that's over in Europe. It was designed very well at the time. It's got a nice moat in there. It's got some bridges and drawbridges. It's got other security fundamentals built in as far as gates and guards and so on. Okay. Theoretically, this should keep the bad guys out. And in the days of low technology warfare, it did most of the time. Okay, unless you had an insider, and we'll talk about that in a minute. How many of you have been to London, to the Tower of London? Okay, pretty fantastic building, pretty interesting history. The Thames River has actually moved away from the tower. But back in the old days, so to speak, is that they actually had a moat completely around the tower. So again, you had your firewalls here, so you keep the firewalls in, you have your moat, which is a DMZ, and so forth. And it was, again, a concept of defense in depth and so forth. And to my knowledge, the tower was never taken over. Here's another example. This is another castle, and this one is showing, again, this has got a little bit more of a DMZ kind of a concept. There's a firewall, a DMZ, a firewall. For those of you doing architecture of your network, there's some very simple approaches. And then my favorite one that I just came across yesterday is in Romania, and this one is really cool because he's got a moat, okay? And then he's got a little bit of a DMZ here with this open area, and then there's another firewall, and another DMZ, and another firewall, and then the inside of the keep, okay? So in theory, this is a very well-designed defense in depth concept, okay? And I didn't have time to investigate the history of this castle, but one of the weak links is an insider, and also phishing attacks where the poor little old lady comes up, and she says, hey, could you please let me in? I'm poor, I'm starved, and there's bad guys out here. And then she walks in and then pulls a sword out and kills everybody, right? So that's a phishing attack, old-fashioned phishing attack. All right. Well, anyway, I've got a message for the king, and the message is that the walls have been breached, and we've got a lot of these different brand names that you've heard about: Home Depot, J.P. Morgan, Dairy Queen, Target, Michaels, Heartland, which is a while ago, Sony, Sega, WikiLeaks. Here's our friend, Mr. Snowden, right, who's also been releasing information. The bottom line is that we're in trouble when it comes to cybersecurity, and as we know from even these very recent logos that are in the news, the bottom line is that you should never assume that you've not been hacked. You should never assume that you are protected. Now, does that mean you should just fire all your security staff and then just cross your fingers? Absolutely not. You still have things that you have to do, okay, which I'll talk about in a minute. So this theme of assumption of breach has been around kind of on and off in the press for, I don't know, since 2010. Deborah Plunkett, who's from the National Security Agency, had a speech which at the time in December of 2010 was very, very profound. And this, of course, was before the NSA had kind of reached the peak of news about the other things that they're doing in the background. But you can see her comment is that computer systems must be built with the assumption that the adversaries will get in. In December 2010, this was very, very profound. And from an agency which is one of the leading cybersecurity agencies in the world, if not the country. So that was quite a surprise. And even as she goes into her speech, she says, further, most sophisticated attackers are going to go unnoticed on the NSA's networks. And I would wager that's what happened with Home Depot, Target, etc. Okay? And if you study the Target breach, for instance, the CIO had a mandate that said, okay, we will not do any patching of any of our systems during the Thanksgiving to Christmas sales cycle. So what we're going to do is we're going to do all our patching right before Thanksgiving, so that Black Friday is perfect and we're not interrupting any of the work, and then it goes through the rest of the month. Well, the problem is that the hackers actually were able to plant some malware in the patching system, which is probably WSIS or something like that, in the system for the point of sale systems before the Uber patching day of Thanksgiving. And then, of course, it contaminated all the systems. The point of sale systems were all now hacked. And it was almost a perfect hack. It was very, very impressive in a Saturday. And my wife and I had both shopped there for Christmas, so we lost our credit cards. PricewaterhouseCoopers is a consulting firm. You've probably heard of them. In January 2011, they came out with a paper that was really along the lines of, it says, the title is, "Are You Compromised But Don't Know It?" And I think that's a theme I'm trying to push here, right? And the paper is actually very good. I'd recommend that if you want an interesting read, it's fairly quick. But they really basically are pushing the things that, you have to recognize that you have been breached or you will be breached, no matter what. And by the way, this is not just for businesses, this is for people. And then it brings in some other ideas as far as realistic approaches on what you should do, which I'll talk about in just a moment. I had a chance to listen to the Chief Technology Officer from a company called Heartland Payment Systems. Now, for those of you who might remember, several years ago, Heartland at the time was one of the biggest breaches that occurred. They're a credit card processing company, and I had a chance to hear Chris Herron speak, and I talked to him afterwards and asked him, well, what happened? How did you guys, how did you finally realize that you had been hacked? Besides leaking out on the internet all your credit cards and so forth that you've been processing. And he said after they did their forensics review and their analysis, they actually figured out that someone had come through a phishing attack into their system through the executive offices, which then whoever the bad guy was, and they still really didn't know, was inside their network, mapping the entire network for about 3 to 5 months. And they were determining from the enterprise side where all the data was, where the data stores were, what the architecture was, weak links, and so forth. And then once they finally figured out where all the credit cards were, they finally had the breach, and it was essentially a giant exfiltration that happened over a weekend. So it wasn't a matter of this continuous thing going on. It was a matter of slow, under the radar, nice and quiet. And then when finally the attack comes, it's on a weekend when people aren't paying attention, and boom, they've lost all the credit cards. Well, anyway, talking to Chris, who was the new Chief Technology Officer after the breach, similar to other events that have had, like Target no longer had a security officer or a CEO after the breach. He says a new approach by Heartland is to take all possible and practical steps to protect the data, but they will assume security systems and data can and have been breached. And Tom Heiser, who is the president of RSA, which is a big security company, basically another very, very astute comment, in my opinion, is that more companies every day are acknowledging that in order to survive in this new era of attacks, we all have to accept the fact that the bad guys are in our network, period. And I applaud him for saying that, because here is a security company basically saying, hey, it's a tough world out there, and we've got to make this assumption. And that was in 2012, so that's 2 years old. Well, a very good friend of mine, who's also my mentor, is Mr. Kirk Bailey. He's the Chief Information Security Officer at the University of Washington. Kirk and I were working together at the City of Seattle, where Kirk was the CISO. And in about 2002-2003 timeframe, during one of my many conversations with him, he introduced this concept to me of the assumption of breach. And it was essentially, his advocacy was, it's not a matter of if, but when. He was a lone crier in the darkness, no one would pay attention to him. He was being laughed at by entities saying, oh, pshaw, you know, I've got firewalls, I've got everything else. Well, guess what? It's not the case. So, you know, Kirk's got this advocacy. He says that you have to have this philosophy, and this philosophy has to be throughout the organization, including the board of directors, the CEO, the recognition of the key data is the focus. Okay, you have to recognize this. But I wrote an article not too long ago, a couple years ago, I guess, and I basically said, you realize from a security professional to have Jim go into the CTO or to the governor and say, we have to assume we've been breached, they're going to yell at him. They're going to say, Jim, you're not doing your job. Okay? And I've had this as a CISO in my past life, and I said it's a tough pill to swallow as a security professional because you're basically saying, I can't do the job. Now, I don't mean to be fatalistic. You can do the job. It's just a matter of accepting the fact that you're going to have to just amp up your work level to be more defensive. So, how do you proceed? That's what I really want to focus on today. What are the suggested actions on how to proceed? And this applies to you as a government employee, as an owner of a business, as an employee of a business, or as an individual who basically uses technology. If you use Amazon or eBay, etc., there's certain things you should be doing just to try and stay ahead of your concerns. And there's one thing I want to talk about before I proceed. It's a model that, I don't know, I was having a conversation with someone, and I finally realized that being a CISO or a security professional is what's called the kitchen strainer model. Okay? Your job is to cover every hole in the strainer with one hand. Okay? Because they aren't going to get enough resources, so you can't cover every hole in the strainer. Okay? And how many holes does a bad guy need to get in? One. So it's darn hard. So last night at dinner, Jim was handing me a strainer saying, would you cover all the holes in? All right, so let me talk about Mr. Bailey's top 10. Now, Kirk's an amazing guy. He's truly my mentor. I've learned so much from him, but also we banter off of each other about all sorts of issues. And so as I learn from Kirk learns from me, and we talk about, well, how to proceed. But let me go through this top 10 list. Sounds like a David Letterman thing, right? So first thing is implement a risk management framework. So what does that mean? What it means is that you have to look at your entire entity, organization, whether it be your government entity or business, and realize that I have to look at everything with a risk perspective. So let me give you a very bizarre example. The voicemail server for the parking garage probably doesn't have as much really important data on it as your voicemail server for the CEO or the governor's office. Okay? So which one are you going to protect more? The CEO's voicemail server. Okay? So we did that through a risk assessment process. We looked at it to try and weigh which one is more important. So now I will devote my resources to the governor's office and not necessarily to the voicemail server in the parking garage. Which leads into the second one, conduct asset profiling and inventory. You need to know where your crown jewels are. And each one of you represents probably a different department in the state. Of course, you're also in the Office of Technology. And the question is, what are the crown jewels? Now, if you happen to be like a health and human services type environment, it's going to be a lot of HIPAA-related type information. It's hospital data, patient data, and so forth. That's really, really important because if you breach that, one, you can get fined by the federal government, and two, you can also have loss of trust by your citizens. And now they basically say, well, I don't believe you. Why should I even, endorse you as a government entity to help? You've got to know where your crown jewels are. And then when you do that, you separate them out into realizing, okay, I'm going to have to protect these, and I'll talk about some concepts. You have to prioritize the assets and the risk mitigation efforts. Okay, I've figured out what they are, now what do I do? Okay. The fourth one, which I tend to put number one almost always for the people, is incident response. If there's anything you do in a security program besides start to realize you need a security program, is set up an incident response process with defined roles and very meticulous approaches, because the first thing that's going to happen, even if you were building a brand new house, right, the first thing you should do is have some insurance and understand what you do in case there's a fire in your brand new structure. That's your incident response. So get that built early and practice it. Implement aggressive risk transfer programs, and Kirk is really good at this. What he does as a state, because the University of Washington's a state entity, and is a thorn in Agnes Kirk's side sometimes. What he'll do is he'll basically negotiate with contractors to say, okay, let's assume that I'm doing a cloud contract and that I'm releasing data or giving data into the cloud provider. Well, what Kirk will do is he'll look very, very hard at the terms and conditions of the contract and essentially say, hey, if there is a breach of data, that is your responsibility. That is your fault, and you will be responsible financially and also from the standpoint of handling the breach. But one thing I want you to do is do not release any information to the press about the contents of the data without contacting me first. Because what he's trying to avoid doing is saying, okay, I had a breach, and by the way, here's the following 37 customers that were on my server that just got breached. He doesn't want that because that also hurts him. So it's just a term and condition that is a very elementary explanation, but gives you a sense. He plays a lot of hardball on risk transfer. He's also gone to Lloyd's of London to build a cybersecurity insurance policy for the University of Washington. So because he believes in getting the risk transfer out to protect the university. Establish and sustain active and strategic alliances. This is a really good example where you come out, exchange business cards, you try and meet other people that can help you not only understand the security issues of the day, but also who you can pick the phone up or send an email to and say, hey, I get some weird stuff going on. How many of you saw that email that came from eBay? You know, that doesn't look right. Or, hey, Jim, you know, I'm calling Jim's office up. Saw an email from eBay, doesn't look right, doesn't seem right, but I'm going to assume I'm being breached, and I'm going to call you up and tell you about it before I click on the link, by the way. And also include trusted vendors and security providers. And I'm not saying that as a vendor and security provider. I'm basically saying you need to be prepared for the event. You need to assume you are going to be breached. It's just like, what would you do if you knew your house was going to burn down or be robbed in a week? You'd make sure your insurance is in order. You'd make sure that you knew what the phone number was for the fire department. You might even reposition your house as it's being built to be closer to a fire hydrant. I mean, those are the things that you'll be thinking about ahead of time. Number 7, implement a business intelligence program. Know who the attackers are, know where they're coming from, and try and understand why. A dashboard approach is okay. It's kind of like a metrics. I think that video that Jim showed earlier that came from Verizon showing the bursts of attacks is a good way to get a sense of where this is coming from. But the intelligence program can also be things like, okay, you're a government agency, make sure you're dealing with other government agencies to understand what they're seeing and feeling and understanding and what they're using for monitoring and measurements. Take a good hard look at what DHS can offer through their various programs, and you guys are in the multi-state ISAC, and take a good hard look at what they can offer. There's a lot of good things there to give you intelligence as to what the attacks are. And you have to just pay attention to this. I actually did do simple things like I have Google Alerts established where I go to the Google News Service and I basically put in China cybersecurity, put in you know, other attack vectors that might be, you know, point of sale, cyber attacks, etc. And so the news items come in moderately proactively, and I can at least monitor that and get a sense of what I should worry about. Number 8 is establish advanced incident response management. I've already talked about it, incident response. You got to do that early, but this is where you take a good hard look at how you can do it better, faster, more thorough, and you're going to look at, outside the normal cyber incident response practices. So, for example, most phishing attacks that have been very successful tend to go to executive suites. Perhaps the governor, I don't know, for the state of West Virginia, it could go to CEOs. It could also go to their administrative assistants. Well, a couple of years ago, I was on an engagement with an oil company, and they weren't believers in phishing attacks and where they would be targeted to executives. So what I did is I said, okay, give me a couple days, and I'll give you a perfect attack vector. So I went online, all publicly available documents, annual report, looked at the executives, executive bios. I then took that information, tried to figure out where they went to university, what their background is, were they in the military, and so forth. And I would look at Facebook and LinkedIn for them, and then I would essentially build a profile, and then I built a phishing attack to basically say, dear CEO of oil company, I noticed you're a Wake Forest graduate. Here's a picture of the brand new building that's being built on campus. This is really spectacular. You should take a look at it. Might even have a couple of our names in there because of our history with the university, blah, blah, blah. Click on this PDF, and you'll get to see the picture. Perfect attack. The PDF is poison. It attacks, just like was shown with Kennedy. What he did is he sent her a poisoned photograph. She clicked on it, and it downloaded essentially a background attack into her computer. Same approach for executives. So it's not that hard. It's really simple to do, people. Practice strategic isolation and enclaving. So remember I talked about here you go out and look at your crown jewels and you try and establish what they are. Well, what you'll do now is segregate them out. So you originally have a firewall and a perimeter that still do care. It's appropriate. You should still do that. You still have a DMZ. It's appropriate. You should do that. But now maybe what you do is you take your information and your crown jewels and you enclave it. You put another firewall around it. You have another different access control into it that maybe uses a different Active Directory environment for usernames and passwords and access control and authentication. Okay, that way there, if I can figure out a way to hack into your systems on the outside perimeter and I'm able to get your username and passwords for your common Active Directory, I still may not be able to break into that other enclave, that other environment. Now you're going to sit there and go, Ernie, you're crazy, that's expensive, it's hard to do, it's inconvenient. You got to do it. You've got to spend the time and the money, or else you're just going to basically say, oh, okay, I give up. Apparently, who was it recently? I think it was one of the companies that was recently attacked. Was through somebody had gone in, found an individual's information, sent in a request to that individual in their personal email for something to do with their Amazon account, hazard a guess that the username and password that they received through this phishing attack would also parallel their work-related username and password, which it did because he had the same username and password for both work and Amazon. They then broke into the company and then started figuring out where all the data was and did the breach. So there's a hint in here, don't ever have username and password for your personal stuff the same as work. Ever, 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 ever. Just don't do that. And then number 10 is consider an active response capability. Now Mr. Bailey is really big on this. Active response is hacking back. The federal government frowns on this. Something to do with establishing a war between you and China is not deemed as acceptable. But the point is that you may at least start thinking about that. What would you do if someone was shooting at you? What would you do if someone was attacking you? what I'd highly recommend you do is think ahead. Get the DHS involved, the FBI, Secret Service, whoever, so that you know how to address this as the events unfold. Now, PricewaterhouseCoopers has this list of items on here. I'm not going to bore you by reading all this. Some of it's very consistent with what I just raised. But for example, the one that's a really easy one is analyze all phishing emails. Take a look at these emails. Try and understand where they came from. Look at the headers. Look at the IP addresses. Look at where the hots were. Try and understand where they came from so that it might help you understand who the attacker is and why they're attacking you. Because once you understand that, at least it gives you a sense of how to defend yourself, how to go back and do better protection, how to make notifications. Plus also, once you figure that out, maybe you go to another state government and say, hey, heads up, we've got this attack in progress. And then this one I do want to go through a little bit because this is how you know you've been breached. Now, one that's really not on here is usually when you get a phone call or an email from the FBI, Secret Service, somebody else out in the internet who says, I just saw a bunch of your data on the internet and it didn't look right. Heads up. And you respond by going, oh, shucky darns. And it looks like we've been breached, okay? But that's the first one that you know you're going to get zapped. You've been zapped. But there's other things to look at. Look at your network traffic, especially on times when you're not working. You guys had Columbus Day off, right? So one of the things that I would have recommended is you take a look at your egress traffic on Columbus Day because it's a holiday. Try and see if someone's been in your network and is used taking advantage of everyone taking the day off so they can just start shoveling out information back to for use. Another one is out of disk space or significantly reduced free disk space. They're trying to hoard stuff, right? They're trying to put it all in one spot. So they might be stealing your storage in order to save things into one location so they can bundle it up into a giant zip package and send it off. There was an attack years ago by someone out of Eastern Europe. What they would do is they would bundle the data up into the size of a CD, which is what, 740 megabytes or something like that. Okay, but they bundle it up into that size for all the data, and then like every couple hours they just send out one CD's worth of data. Boink, boink, boink. And then the receivers would take it, download it, make a CD, and that was very portable, and they could work with it. So just another option to take a look at. High CPU usage, it means there's something weird going on. If you have a bot on your machine, you'll see a high CPU usage. Creation of new user accounts, especially administrative users. That's the ones where you've got to stay on top of it. You've got to pay attention. So sometimes companies will have their administrators log in as admin, and the password is admin1234, something horrible like that. Well, what I recommend you do is don't have admin and simple passwords. If you're an admin, then you're going to use your username or a designated username and a password, and that's one that you stay on top of and change it very, very frequently. Attempted or actual use of administrative level accounts, I just kind of talked about that. Locked out accounts, that means somebody on the inside is poking, and after 3 or 5 attempts, it locks you out. Unfortunately, there's some systems that don't lock people out. The account is in use when the user's not at work. Somebody comes into work on Monday and they turn on their computer and it basically, they can't log in because it's in use. That's an urgency. Call up the office of the CISO and say, this is weird. I'm really concerned about what's going on. Cleared log files. That means someone's been in there and they're erasing their tracks. Log files are full with an unusually large number of events. Okay, that's because they haven't had the ability to erase the logs. There's also a technique where your log files are basically off of the machine or in a separate location that the attacker cannot access and erase. Of course, antivirus, intrusion detection system alerts, disabled AV software. Somebody comes in and turns it off. Patch changes. There are stories of people doing attacks, taking advantage of an unpatched machine or unpatched web browser, and because they want to own you and not have anybody else in there, they will patch your machine. So you can save money, Jim. Just go ahead and hire a hacker and patch up all your machines, right? But that's a way to do that. So if you have a change in your machine that's an improvement in the patch and you weren't expecting it, that could be somebody's on your machine. Machines connecting to outside IP addresses. For example, how much traffic do you have going to China out of West Virginia? I don't think you're going to have a lot. So maybe what you should do is even just block it. There's no reason to have traffic going to some of these countries, especially from this state. I'm just guessing, because I mean, you could have a company owned by the Chinese here that has to do that. I don't know. Request for information about the system. These are social engineering attempts. These are phishing attacks, etc. Unexpected changes in your configurations, and then systems shutting down. Okay, so this list comes out of a NIST document. It's actually a pretty good checklist, but this is the kind of thing, and this is why it's good that you're here today. These are the kinds of things that you should sit back and go, wow, I seen that, or I knew that. And if you're a supervisor, just make sure your people know, here's some symptoms. And then on incident response, I had to laugh about this because Kelvin earlier was talking about fire trucks. Well, look at my pictures. So it was unplanned event. But there's an incident response fire truck, and what you need to do is you've got to be ahead of the game. You've got to be prepared. You've got to have the ability to identify what the incidents are, how you contain it, how you eradicate it, how you recovery, and how you take advantage of lessons learned. And I really want to talk about and emphasize the lessons learned. Even if you do an exercise, one of the weakest areas I've noted in the industry is that people don't take advantage of the lessons learned from an exercise. They do their exercise and then they're all gone, but really you've got to spend quality time on doing your after-action report and taking a good hard look at what the lessons learned were and then fixing the problems. I'll talk about that in a moment, about some very, very good tools that I'd suggest you download. So for some quick references, if you're interested in this subject and you want to learn more, I've written some articles, and this PowerPoint will be available for you guys. But I've written some articles on this about the various subjects. So there's the links. There's the PricewaterhouseCoopers article, another article I wrote for a company called Tofino. But the last two slides are some references that I'd like you to be aware of, and especially for after-action reports. You know, you've had your exercise, you've had a real event, which I hope you don't have. Take advantage of the lessons learned. There's actually a couple of very good ones. A good list I saw was from all places of the Department of Office of Operations and the Highway Administration, U.S. Highway Administration, Department of Transportation. It's actually a really good list of post-event activities. It's not a bad checklist. Take a good look at that. There's also a really decent little PowerPoint that was done by the EPA on how to conduct an after-action report, and the links are there. And then the one that I really recommend you have downloaded and in your kit is a Microsoft Word template that's available for FEMA on after-action reports, and I've got the link right there. I've actually used this a couple times, and it's perfect because it forces you to what kind of questions to ask, how to pay attention to who's involved, and so forth. Now, if you're in another department that has nothing to do with cyber, believe it or not, this is also very, very good for activities. Like, for example, let's say you have a big parade or a big event that you want to have, or your inauguration of your governor and so forth. This is a great tool, just a standpoint of going through after the event to make a list of all the lessons learned, what you gained from it, and then use it for future improvements. So I know I went through pretty fast. What I'm really trying to tell you is that you should assume you've been breached and take all your actions as if you've been breached. So again, let's go back to something very simple like your house. How many of y'all have homeowners insurance? Okay, not quite 100%, but that's good, okay? And how many of you let's see. Forget that. I was going to say I was going to have another idea, but we'll just leave that alone. But the message I really want you to do is that say to yourself, the reason why I own a homeowner's insurance is probably because you can't go alone without it, right? You get that out of the way. But the other option is just like for car insurance, right? If I have an accident, at least I've got some sense of protection here. Well, you need to assume that something's going to happen and start taking actions today to protect yourself. So with that, without further ado, that concludes my comments. I'm happy to answer any questions if available, and Jim, I can talk afterwards too. So.
Do we have any questions? Well, Ernie, I'm going to ask you a question. When you have that list of things, yeah, when we have the list of things up there about things or symptoms of maybe you've got a problem, I thought of my own PC and how it just shuts down sometimes all by itself. And I'm forever looking at the task manager and seeing what processes are running and what's hogging the, because sometimes the response time isn't very good. And you'd think as a security professional I would know exactly what to do, but sometimes I struggle. I do use tools, and there's some things out there that are free and available to people to use. And they can look at your registry, and they can look at your internet files, the temporary internet files that are clogging up your space on your computer. But do things come to mind that you typically do, that you would like to share?
Sure. So actually, this goes back to Columbus. When we were up there, I was struggling with a particular program that stopped working. It was working great, and it just stopped working. To be frank, I didn't assume it was I would have been hacked. I was thinking this, like I got a Microsoft patch that came in that broke the system or whatever. But a couple tools that I use is I'm a Norton antivirus person. So just to give you a sense of my bias, but also I use a tool called Malwarebytes, and that's a free tool, which is really, in my opinion, exceptional. I've been quite surprised at some of the things that it's been able to find on my machine and clean up. So, and that's a free tool. So those are two things that come to mind. I'll give you a quick sidebar. So I was in China about 4 weeks ago, and the Chinese are notorious for breaking into computers and USB drives and so forth. So before I went, I actually went through a list that you can pull down offline that basically the things how you should protect your machines. For example, you're supposed to cover your computer with breakable tape so that you can tell if someone's broken into your machine. You should make sure that you have a USB drive that's fully encrypted. I use one that's got AES 256 byte encryption on it. And then should not use a cell phone that's from the U.S., but instead use a cell phone that you can just throw away because the SIM card is probably contaminated with a listening device, etc. And that's essentially what I did. Now back to your question, Jim. So again, tools I use is Norton, Malwarebytes, and sometimes I use AVG as a quick download. I also use the Microsoft malware detection tool. But when I came back from China, even though it wasn't my laptop, it was a laptop for the company that I was doing work for, before I attached it to any network that I owned, like my wireless network or my wired network, I went to a Starbucks, used their wireless, and basically went through, updated all the antivirus patterns, Malwarebytes, and then scanned the living daylights out of this computer. Fortunately, I didn't find anything, so knock on for my good, right? But the point is that's just the best I could do without shredding the computer, which I would have liked to have done, but I couldn't because somebody else owns it. So, and as far as the cell phone goes, I actually rented a cell phone, and the most perfect security in that cell phone was it didn't work while I was there, so it didn't matter. Right?
Thank you, Ernie. Any other questions?
Don't we shoot ourselves in the foot because of transparency and they want everything out there for the public's right to know?
Okay, so the question was, don't we shoot ourselves in the foot due to transparency and you getting it out in the public? That's a fantastic point. I'll tell you a social engineering attack. that's very easy to do, and I actually just showed the utility of this, is, for example, when you post a job for someone in the IT space, what do? You say, I need a SAP developer or a Windows, multi-scratch developer, Windows 2008 servers. You got the idea. It's kind of like you're listing all this stuff you've got, or Juniper firewall expert and so forth. I just look at that and go, okay, state of West Virginia, see Juniper firewalls, Windows 2008. I know what you have. I now can at least get a sense of from reconnaissance how to attack you, take advantage of that. Yes, I agree with that. And the problem, though, is that I think, especially in today's environment of technology and Facebook and everything else, people are crazy. They just shovel all this stuff out in the network. And they're assuming trust. They're trusting the rest of the world when really you've got to think, as I teasingly say, I'm a paid professional, unmedicated paranoid. I mean, that's my job. If I work for Jim, I need to come to him and say, Jim, I'm going to tell you the 1,500 things that petrify me about your network. He'll look at me and go, thanks, I'm really glad I hired you. Not. And what the heck do I do about this? So that's where I go back and say, okay, where's your family jewels? Where's the crown jewels? How do we protect these? And just expect that crap's going to happen elsewhere in the network. Question.
One of my concerns across the enterprises is there's not a uniform data classification system, and I noticed it's one of the things that's in one of the missed documents. In going to the point of transparency, what may be confidential or secure be classified as PII or PHI under healthcare regs as a data element, one of those 18 identifiers. In terms of purchasing division or the tax department is not PII or PHI. So it's publicly viewable over there, and by looking at an enterprise like the state government, because we don't have a uniform data classification system, it's like Legos, you can get a block over here, and put it here, and put it here, and build. Do you have any suggestions or guidance on developing such a system? Especially, the big thing that concerns me is you can get information from the Department of Education and public websites over there, names, things like that, and then you can take that, and if you know they're a state employee, then you get to actually build on that from that point. So do you have any guidance with that?
Excellent question. Did everybody hear that okay? So I don't need to repeat it. What do you say? Okay. I've not had to do that specifically, but in my past life, we tried to have a universal data classification scheme, and I think your idea about looking at maybe congealing everything, like what's HIPAA telling me to declare as secure, what's the new privacy regulations like Appendix J and the new 800-53 is telling you what to protect and so forth. So maybe like a singular document for that might help you. I don't know. I don't have a good sense of what all the data is in the state, but it makes a lot of sense because especially you've got like Health and Human Services and social workers doing things that I could argue are HIPAA related, but like I say, they aren't declared as such. And there's education rules for protection of grades and so forth. A really good problem. If I were to solve that, I would just start with a single standard, like the federal government or somebody out there has got a good one, and just use that as a starting point. Recognizing that all the data, it's your weakest link is the one person. And I'll give you a quick story. So I had when I was in the early days of Bring Your Own Device. When I was CISO at the Port of Seattle, I had a guy who had a little Trio. Remember the Trios? It looked like a BlackBerry. And it was stolen, or he lost it or something, right? I started asking him, I was doing the investigation, I said, okay, well, was there any company data on your phone? Nope, no, didn't have any on there, okay. Did you have any credit card information on your phone? Nope, no credit card. Did you have any social security numbers on there? Let me think about that. Yeah, I did. I had my entire scout troops information on that phone that included social security number, their health insurance number, the primary care doctor's name, of course the kid's name, etc. And this was before data breach laws had really come into play. But I'm sitting there going, well, that's terrible, because here this guy had his phone taken, but the Port of Seattle was protected because it wasn't ours, but I was concerned about him because he just lost his scout troops information. And how did he react to that? So anyway, I'm not totally sure I answered your question, but at least it gives you a story that data can be dangerous everywhere.
Well, we did do a data classification here in the state several years ago, and we're ramping up to do it another time. And it might be a good time for us, Tom, to talk to you a little more about how we could do that to try to normalize what a data type really is. And the PHI is different in one organization than another. We do have a problem, but we want to do this next data classification right. It's a painful process, and we want to try to get it the outcome, because data classification is so important. It's like risk assessment and being able to actually protect the most important data you have in the most powerful way you can protect it. Are there other questions? I thought I saw him.
We talk about prevention on all these breaching, such as the big corporations that's been hit here recently. What, as a personal consumer, would be a way to pinpoint if you are breached? Is there a way to determine who has done that and for preventative measures in the future? Or
okay. So the question is, how do I protect myself to know if I've been breached? I wished I had the perfect answer, then I would be making a lot more money than I am today, right? So, because even LifeLock, which this guy brags about as a perfect way to protect yourself, he's been hacked. Okay, so go figure, right? Okay, so a couple of things to pay attention to is if I'm a hacker, one of the things I do with a credit card is I'll do a mini charge just to see if the card's still good. So I would recommend you look at your charges, and if you see like a 25-cent charge or a $5 charge or a $1 charge at your local 7-Eleven or something like that that doesn't make sense, you should focus on that right away, because that to me means that you probably get your card's been breached. And I would call my bank up right away and just say, I want my card turned off. I want a new card. That's one thing you should do. The second thing you can do is, of course, pay attention to who's being breached. For example, that list up there is not all inclusive. There's other companies that have been breached they're trying not to be really, they're trying not to broadcast it, right? Or else they're in the middle of an investigation, so they don't broadcast it at all. And under state breach laws, I don't know about the state of West Virginia, but state of Washington breach law is if the data, if you are conducting an investigation, you can delay your notification. Okay, so you have to watch out for that. So what I would do is try and just pay close attention to the news, and if I hear about somebody who's at me, do it. Third thing is, if I happen to have Experion has a, actually I get it through Costco, it's called Data Guard or something like that, but essentially it's like $10 a month, and they'll notify me if there's an unusual event on my credit card, someone's asking for a credit reading on me, and so forth. And I have it for both myself and my wife and my daughter, so that if we get an email that says heads up, so in case I wasn't looking for a loan, at least I knew somebody was poking around. And then the third thing I recommend is to use your credit card, not your debit card, if you're going to do it. And people will go, well, why do you want to do that, right? I'm trying to keep my debt low. Under the laws are that if you have a credit card that's been breached or stolen, you're protected for anything above the first $50, and a lot of banks will cover the first $50. Okay? A debit card has no such law. So someone could clean out your account, you go to the bank and say, bank, my debit card's been breached, and under the law, they don't have to do anything. Now, most banks will do that. They'll take care of you, right? But don't be surprised someday when a bank finally says, like a big one, says, that's it, we're done. We're not going to protect debit cards anymore because it's costing too much money. So Those are, oh yeah, another thing I do is I travel internationally a lot. So what I'll do is before you travel to areas outside your area where you live, especially for me internationally, I go to the bank, I'm online, or let's call the bank up and say, hey, I'm going to be in China, Philippines, and Indonesia during this time period. I'll be using my credit card. I expect to have charges then, but if you see charges before or after that, I need a notification ASAP. So, and if any of you use American Express cards, American Express is probably one of the best ones for fraud detection. And just, that's an unpaid commercial. There was a question over here.
Can you talk to us about Macintoshes? Are they, the perception used to be that they're not as hackable, that they're not as targeted, and I'm just wondering about their security now with all the onslaught of other Apple products.
So the question is about Macintosh or Mac operating systems and whether they're unhackable and so forth. And I remember getting in heated arguments with people 10 years ago about this, like, oh, my Mac can't be hacked. And rah, rah, rah. Okay, it was essentially, it's a Unix operating system versus a Windows and so forth. Well, the hackers in those days, it was easy to get really smart on Windows operating systems, and as a result, it was easier for me to hack them. And then secondly is the most frequently used operating system was a Windows, right? So as a result, if I'm going to do a hack, I'll attack the 80% because that's an easier target than the 20%. That's changed totally in the last 3 to 5 years because people are after data. They don't care whether it's a Windows or a Macintosh or a Unix or a Linux. They just want the data. So I would say that if you're a Macintosh on a wireless network in Starbucks, you're just as much a target as I am with my Windows device. And I've used both, so it's not like as if I'm totally technology free. Other questions?
Hey, you talked about a couple tools that you can use in kind of a PC environment. You know, increasingly we're using more and more mobile devices. Are there tools for both Android, iPhone, BlackBerry kind of environments to protect some of that mobile data that we're using more and more and more?
Okay. BlackBerry, I'm going to defer because I haven't touched a BlackBerry for years. Android and iOS, you can download antivirus and anti-phishing and malware stuff. Norton has a tool. I think Symantec also does. The only thing I would say is that you're going to have to pay. They're not free. And then secondly is that even antivirus is only as good as what signatures they're aware of and how often you update your machine. There's a very famous test done every year in Germany. It's a round-robin test where someone goes out and collects all this garbage off the internet and then puts it out for testing by all the different vendors, the antivirus vendors. The most effective antivirus vendors are usually only 75 to 80% effective. So that means there's 20% of the garbage on the internet they can't protect you from. So even if you were to put a Norton or whatever on your cell phone, you should assume you've been hacked because that's 20% that they can't touch. And there's a guy who's advertising on TV right now about how his machine is the best and it's managed by US people and all this kind of stuff. And I say, well, that's nice, but it's still another 20% that he cannot identify. And it's getting worse because of what they call 0 days, where you, for example, could be a professional hacker and you discover all these marvelous ways to attack a Windows machine, and nobody in the world knows it yet, right? So you could either A, sell that to your friendly local bad guy, and then he uses it for an attack. B, you use it yourself for an attack. Or C, you basically go back to Microsoft or other entities and say, I've got this information that I would like to present to you so that we can protect the environment. That's the ethical approach, right? Unfortunately, there's a lot more people who are willing to make money off of this stuff than they are to do the ethics.
Okay, it looks like we have, oh, sorry.
What is the safety of your data in the cloud? If you're normally putting your stuff up, or if you're in an environment where you have your information in a cloud server farm somewhere, what's the safety? Is it safer than being on your device or not?
Wow, great question.
Fantastic question. Let's see. Number one, I will recommend that you go to, if you're interested in the cloud security, go to the cloudsecurityalliance.org, I think it is. And they have a guide for security in the cloud. And I was involved in like Rev 1 or 2 a couple years ago. It's like on Rev 3 or 4 right now. Great way to get acclimated to security in the cloud. I will get to the answer in just a moment. But the cloud is a very complicated answer. For example, I would wager, okay, how many of you have a Yahoo or a Hotmail account? That's the cloud. That has been the cloud forever. Okay? Just they didn't use the term cloud when Hotmail got invented 10 years ago, or Yahoo, or AOL was the cloud. So number one, a cloud is a very different kind of monster. It depends on how it's built. For example, if you guys use virtual machines for the state of West Virginia and it's strictly managed in-house, that's essentially a private cloud. Okay, so right away, you have to think of that. That's a cloud. You have data housed someplace else. How do I protect that? Now let's go back to today's environment for the cloud. For example, like Facebook cloud. What's the one with the pictures got released for all these Shutter, Snapchat, I think it was. The pictures got released for all these Hollywood movie stars, something else. My opinion is your best bet is that don't post stuff up that you would never want to see on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the local newspaper, period. Even if you assume it's safe. Because, again, assume you've been hacked. So number one is I wouldn't do that. Number two is that if you insist on going into a cloud environment and you hear how great it is, you just got to do your homework and accept the fact that if I'm going to put certain banking data up or personal information up, then you need to think about your responsibility, not the responsibility of the owner. Because the guys who are running the cloud services are doing it to make money. And if they can figure out a way to make a lot of money, then there's other options. The last thing I'll say about the cloud, for example, if you try to go to the cloud, let's say Jim decides to go to the cloud for something for the state. Okay, you have some clout to come in and say, all right, I'm telling you for a cloud provider that I don't want any other entities in the virtual machine. I don't want to be adjacent to a bank. As far as the stack of, if you will, operating systems in the virtual machine. I want to make absolutely sure that I'm not touching anybody that's going to be a target and so forth. Okay, you can do that. As an individual, you don't have that cloud. I mean, you have no cloud at all for that. And so again, just think about the data you're posting. And again, if you're, and I talk to my wife and daughter about this all the time, essentially say, look, whatever you post up in the cloud, just assume it's going to be on the front page of the newspaper, and if it's something that's going to embarrass you, just don't do it.
Yeah, Ernie, can I take a little different run at that?
Oh, absolutely.
We have some things in the cloud at the state. We're using Outlook now, Microsoft offering from email, and that's email in the cloud. A lot of state employees would like to use the cloud for storing data and being able to make it accessible to other people. What we tell them is that these free services are really not secure. So consider what you're paying. You all heard the adage that you get what you pay for. It applies with the cloud as well. Now there are cloud services that are perfectly secure. And I say perfectly because it's all imperfect. But let's just say what they do is they encrypt data. You want to have encrypted data at rest. You want to have encrypted data in your communication path to and from. You want to, if you're a state government, for instance, want to be sure that that data is stored onshore. You don't really want to be stored somewhere on foreign soil. you want to understand what happens at the end of your relationship with this cloud provider. Perhaps you've had to bid it out again. You've got a lower bid from somebody else, and there needs to be a clean transfer of your data from one provider to another. You have to think about this in advance. What's the end of the game with this provider? So that's just a little more nuance on the kinds of things you want to think about with data, and I think Ernie's completely right. It's all out of your control once it's up in the cloud. It behooves you to understand who you're dealing with. And I would say that the cloud is definitely in our future. Cloud storage is way less expensive than we can provide it in the state using on-site systems. That's just the way it's going. It's a question of volumes. And because communications are so good, the data can be anywhere, and you have pretty rapid access to it. But think about what you're doing and ask the right questions and get the right assurances, and you're probably going to be okay, but it's going to get better because it's still in its infancy.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And I want to go back to one of the questions was about what tools I use. One tool I definitely use is my hard drive on my laptop is completely encrypted. And always, because if that machine were stolen or lost, then at least one, I have protection that it's hard to get into. Two is under state data breach laws. If it's encrypted, then you don't need to make a notification. And it's just a very, very good practice. And it's easy to do. It's not inconvenient. It's not hard. It works fine. I mean, Microsoft has come up with the something big. I forget the name of it. We use another brand. I forgot. But it's essentially a hard drive encryption. But I highly recommend that you do that. And even on your personal computers, you can encrypt. BitLocker, that's it. Yeah, thanks. And then even on your personal computers, on your desktop machines, even though you're theoretically not worried about someone stealing it, you can also encrypt on your device. Now, I don't know what the state's policy is in that, so I'm not going to tread in that space.
It's all our hard drives.
Okay. The other thing about the cloud, I'll give you a quick story. So a friend of mine at the University of Washington, he's probably similar to what you guys are, what the state rules are, is that everything is open and clear for the public. I think that goes back to your question earlier about transparency. And so people are kind of like, well, why should I hide this or encrypt it? Because, you know, anybody can access it. And, if I get a Freedom of Information request, I'm obligated to provide it. Okay, that's nice. Well, my friend at the university, they happen to have, Department of Defense has advanced physics lab on the site. And what had happened is somebody had posted something up into the cloud that the federal government identified as being top secret, no foreign access. And so they came to the CISO and they said, okay, we need that off, get it out, retrieve it, burn it, do something with it, right? Well, when you take a look at how the cloud works, it's like a backup, and then the backup goes up to the backup, and the backup goes up to the backup. There's no way to know where all your data is. So even if you said, I wanted to delete this record, okay, record X, that record X could be in Singapore, it could be in Hawaii, it could be in Russia, it could be another data center, and okay, I erased that instance of the data, but what about the rest of them? So that's another thing with the cloud is, you know, even though you say, I want all my, you know, these pictures taken off of the web, well, it's everywhere. It's just like always backups and backups and backups and backups. Now that's a benefit of the cloud because it's a disaster response approach, but on the other hand, if you want it erased, you cannot do that.
Thank you, Ernie. I think we're going to have to move on to this point where...
Thank you, guys, for the opportunity.
Thank you.